Welcome to the fall edition of BPEA. We're very excited about the program and to see so many participants in person. There are some online, so please remember that the session is live streamed and recording, so it'll be available on YouTube, and then we'll have some remote participants coming in on Zoom. Before we formally get started, let me introduce Ben Harris, who's Vice President and Director of Brookings Economic Studies program.
Good afternoon, everyone. As Jan said, my name is Ben Harris. I'm the Vice President and Director of Economic Studies here at Brookings. Just briefly, I wanted to thank everyone and welcome you to our fall 2024 BPEA Conference. Let me especially thank the editors, Jan and John, for assembling a truly terrific program here today and tomorrow. I'd also like to thank generous supporters who make the BPEA Conference and Journal possible: the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, General Motors Company, the National Science Foundation, and State Farm Mutual Automobile Insurance Company. Thank you so much for your support. We also thank Dina Axelrod Perry for establishing the George L. Perry and William C. Brainerd BPEA Chair, and Jason Cummings and Brevin Howard Research Services for generously supporting BPEA's mission and activities. Thank you so much. I turn it back over to Jan.
Thanks, Ben. So we'll begin today with a symposium on the Fed's monetary policy framework review. We have 3 papers, so we'll go through the 3 papers and then open for questions and discussion. I want to ask the presenters to please use the podium mic or have a lav mic. Since we have an online audience, we need microphones for everyone. And then when we open for questions, please be sure you have the handheld mic. The first paper is Challenges Around the Fed's Monetary Policy Framework and Its Implementation by Bill English and Brian Sack.
Great, thank you. It's an honor, privilege to be here to talk about the Fed's framework, some of the challenges it faced, both with the framework itself and its implementation. I'm Brian Sack from Balyasny Asset Management. As mentioned, this is joint work with Bill English from Yale School of Management. We're both also ex-Fed guys, so we have that perspective as well. Okay, so the Fed's framework review was launched in 2018. And really was, quite an extensive effort. Involved a lot of reach out to communities, a lot of academic research, and a lot of work from the Fed staff putting it together. The results of the review were announced in August 2020 at Jackson Hole by Chair Powell, and with most of the content presented in a revised statement of longer-run goals and monetary policy strategy released at the time. And then, of course, this framework was thrown immediately into the fire in terms of implementation because we were in the post-COVID economy, we were at the zero bound, inflation was low, the economy was weak, so we really saw the implementation of this framework immediately beginning in the September 2020 meeting. I'm not going to spend much time on context because I think everyone's pretty familiar with this, and just in the interest of time. But big picture, the context was that estimates of the neutral real policy rate had been declining for some time, had reached particularly low levels by 2019. And so that had really put the effective lower bound, the ELB, front and center in policy discussions. And of course, the concern was policymakers wouldn't be able to generate enough accommodation to bring inflation up to the central bank's mandates. And if you looked at survey measures of inflation distributions at the time, you were starting to see some reasonable mass building up at levels below the central bank target. And that was the concern, is that expectations would fall, this would get embedded in inflation, and this would present a meaningful policy challenge. It had presented a meaningful policy challenge. So that's what led to the new framework. Now, what were the components of the new framework? There were 2 primary changes in that framework statement from 2020. One was a focus on shortfalls from maximum employment. This took the place of the previous statement referring to deviations from full employment. So really just a shift of the policy focus towards a more asymmetric focus in terms of the labor market. The other change was the adoption of flexible average inflation targeting, or FATE, in which the FOMC said that it judges that following periods when inflation was running persistently below 2%, it would seek to achieve inflation moderately above 2% for some time. So this is an inflation makeup strategy. It's very familiar to many researchers in this room. It works very well in the models, and it was actually put into practice. But it was put into practice in a very flexible way. There was no specification of the degree of overshooting, no hard-coded rules. It was meant to be flexible, hence the F in FATE. In terms of implementation, the implementation fell to two primary policy tools, the same two tools that have been used since the global financial crisis. One, guidance on the short rate, and two, large-scale asset purchases. And both of these were used quite aggressively after the framework was put in place and in that post-COVID environment. So in terms of the policy guidance, in the September 2020 FOMC statement, it said that it expected to keep the federal funds rate at the ELB until inflation had moved above 2% and was expected to remain above 2%, and the labor market had reached full employment. And that it was an and condition, which I'm going to come back to, that was very important. On the large-scale asset purchases, the FOMC, by the time the framework came out, was well into a very large QE program, and at that time was buying $120 billion of treasuries and mortgages every month, and it continued that program. It continued net purchases until March 2022. So in the end, this was a very large program, something on the order of $4.5 trillion. So these were the same tools that had been used previously, but they were used, quite aggressively. Okay, so our own view of the framework, now getting into our assessment. Well, at a very high level, we basically make 2 points. One is the Fed's new policy framework was aimed too narrowly at the specific set of economic circumstances that it faced at the time, right? The framework is designed for an environment where inflation was too low, inflation expectations were showing some downside fragility, the Phillips curve was very flat, growth was somewhat sluggish relative to what was expected. So in that environment led to these framework changes, but we think a framework probably should be more robust to a wide set of economic situations. The second broad comment is that the implementation of the framework, the use of those two tools, also had some shortcomings, and we would argue really needed more careful calibration and communication by the FOMC. So I'm going to run through those. So first, beginning with the framework itself, we argue, focusing just on shortfalls in the labor market can really hamper effective preemptive monetary policy. Now, there's a bit of ambiguity in parts of the documents and part of the discussion about whether this focus on shortfalls applies to the Fed's objective function or the Fed's policy reaction function. But I think when you read through the documents and listen to the communications from the FOMC at the time, it's quite clear in the end that it's really about the reaction function. So the framework statement itself says that the committee's policy decisions need to be informed by assessments of shortfalls. And Chair Powell was, very clear in 2021 when he said, this means we just won't tighten in response to a strong labor market. So this focus on shortfalls was really about the policy reaction function. And we don't go into this in great detail in the paper, but I think it's intuitive to most people, is that, not responding to actual or expected labor market tightness certainly can be problematic in some situations. So maybe it made sense in an environment where the Phillips curve was very flat, when inflation was low, and you could probe the boundaries of full employment. But in other situations, if inflation expectations are less anchored, or if the Phillips curve is steeper, it's probably not a good idea. We generally believe effective monetary policy has to be forward-looking. There's research addressing this directly in terms of Mike Kiley's recent research showing that you can get poor economic performances by limiting that response to tight labor markets. So I do think this was probably a mistake that was in terms of being geared too much towards that one economic environment. The other major change in the framework, the focus on average inflation targeting, I mean, this one I would say less so a problematic mistake, but I think there can be questions about just how effective this is. And in particular, how effective it is to insert this average in inflation targeting versus just what we would consider to be flexible inflation targeting. So basically, it's generally very difficult, in my view, to really influence private sector expectations through a stated intention of the central bank in terms of this overshooting commitment. And what makes it hard to do, I believe, is this flexibility part of it. The FOMC rightly wanted to retain flexibility and not commit to a size of the overshooting, but I think that diminishes the power of that framework in terms of convincing private agents and market participants about the degree of overshooting. And one thing I find remarkable is, even if we look in September 2020 when the framework was released, and we look at the SEP forecast made at the time, that's the red line here, they didn't show any overshooting. So they showed basically a steady trend of inflation back to the objective. Now, I think you could argue, well, it's because of the 3-year horizon, the overshooting was going to come later. But the point I wanted to make is, given you have this flexibility, and then even in the actual specific forecast, the FOMC didn't show any overshooting. So I think it's very hard for private agents to figure out, what this framework means and how to build that into their expectations. It's kind of remarkable there's no communication about the size of the overshooting. Then, of course, we got the inflation. If we roll that forecast forward a year, we get the gray line, and we have a lot of inflation. But as the chair said, that inflation has nothing to do with the framework, or wasn't the intention of the framework. And at that point, the framework is inoperative. It doesn't speak to what's done. In fact, at that point, you just kind of revert to regular inflation targeting. So this episode just makes me wonder how much we were gaining with the A in fate. Okay, so turning to implementation, let me start with policy guidance. And clearly, good policy guidance tends to be conditioned on economic outcomes. I mean, I do think that's best practice, and that has worked well in some circumstances. But the guidance put in place in 2020 had a few issues, and that I want to talk about. So that's what I show in the right chart here. This is the unemployment rate plotted against the inflation rate. And what we've drawn is a zone in gray of no liftoff, according to the guidance. And so here we come back to that and condition. So because this guidance required unemployment to fall below U star and inflation to move above pi star, you had this gray area of no liftoff with this kind of wraparound shape. And that wraparound shape actually is what proved to be problematic. So the dots there show realizations of these two variables over time, beginning in September 2020 when it was announced. At that point, we're well into the no liftoff zone, and the FOMC is expecting that we're going to move down to that corner point, and that would be a nice liftoff place. But instead, what happens is we move dramatically to the right as we move down. And so we were getting a lot of inflation, but we had not met the full employment condition for liftoff, and so the committee was sitting there at the ELB. And the issue here is, as you move down and to the right in this chart, you're moving towards larger and larger deviations from a standard monetary policy rule. And the way this guidance was structured really put no limit on how far that deviation could go. What's interesting to me is to contrast that to 2012, when the committee also used state-based guidance with a lot of contribution from then Chicago Fed President Evans. And that guidance really had an or condition. It said we won't lift off until the unemployment rate gets below 6.5%, as long as inflation prospects are below 2.5%. So that guidance had a totally different design to the no liftoff zone, one that actually did impose a minimum on how far down to the right, how far that policy deviation could be. That guidance worked quite well. And another way to see this is to look at the actual deviation from the Fed's balanced approach rule. when the 2012 guidance was met, we were moderately below the rule. And I think good guidance can do this. You don't want to just communicate you're following a standard rule. You may want to communicate you're doing something more aggressive and you want to deviate. But the point is you want to put a limit on how big that deviation can be. 2012 did that. 2020 did not. And in the event, we ended up with a liftoff about 800 basis points below that policy rule. Okay, let me now turn to QE. And I think our general message on QE would be if it's going to be used as a regular policy instrument in these circumstances, then we really should hold it to some of the same standards, or maybe nearly the same standards that we hold the primary policy instrument to. And by that I mean effective calibration and effective communication. So we think QE could be calibrated more carefully. QE4 was a very large program, total 15% of GDP in terms of 10-year equivalents. And that just adds up to a meaningful amount of policy accommodation. I know that mapping from the balance sheet to Fed funds equivalents is very tenuous, empirically and in practice and in concept perhaps, but it's at least a reasonable starting point for benchmarking this. And I think if you look at the literature estimates, you would think that this balance sheet would have been worth 2 or 3 percentage points of additional funds rate easing. And our point would be that it would be surprising if an effective policy rule was actually calling for that much accommodation by the time we got into the second half of 2021 and early 2022. The balanced approach rule we just saw on the previous slide actually was moving into positive territory by Q2 of 2021. So already this additional accommodation wasn't warranted by that rule. And it was just too much. So I think the calibration of QE4 was off, and the program went on for too long. In addition, the Fed was buying mortgages at a time when the housing market was really doing exceptionally well, or was overheating, I should say. In terms of communication, the FOMC did give guidance on asset purchases, but it was vague in nature. It was based on substantial further progress to the goals. If you read through all the speeches, there wasn't much additional clarification beyond that. It's not in the SEP, so you kind of lose that quantification of that tool. So our point here is that it's pretty hard to look at that communication and really figure out what the QE reaction function looks like. Again, if we're going to use QE, we might as well hold it to a higher standard of communicating more crisply and completely about that policy rule. And then one last point on communications. I think the FOMC has generally left too much ambiguity in the purpose of communications between market functioning and QE. There's a result in the paper. One reason to make that distinction is the structure of QE would actually look different in those two purposes. And I think that actually affected, led QE4 to a structure that was probably too short in maturity, because that's where the market functioning problems were. But by the time we transitioned to general QE, we didn't shift it out to longer maturities the way QE3 had. So I know I'm just over, so this is my last slide. Just summing up with our suggested changes, we think the framework should be more constitutional. It should apply to a variety of circumstances. It should highlight principles of monetary policy that we think are robust, which are use your tools aggressively, make sure expectations are anchored at target. But the more specific changes, particularly the shortfalls change, I think doesn't belong in that sort of constitutional document. Improve the implementation of the framework in the directions I talked about, better communication, better calibration. And with those steps, essentially the framework review then becomes not a process of, hey, let's change the framework every 5 years. The framework should have more staying power. The framework review becomes an opportunity to evaluate how it was implemented, what worked, what decisions were made, why they were made, what was good or bad. So it's much more about implementation than the framework itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. The next speaker is Charlie Evans on considerations for a post-pandemic monetary policy framework.
Okay, I want to thank the organizers for inviting me. I suppose my contrarian position today is to argue that the Fed's 2020 long-run strategic framework remains a sturdy foundation for policymaking over the next many years. I certainly agree there are some improvement opportunities, but the bulk of those are operational and tactical in nature, not strategic. Okay, to arrive at this conclusion, I first cite 4 broad features of good monetary policy making that should be familiar. First, when inflation is rising and a problem, raise interest rates. There's no limit to how high interest rates can go. Second, to fight economic distress, lower interest rates. Here, the effective lower bound may limit how much the federal funds rate can be lowered. A good cushion for fighting the onset of a recession is 500 basis points. Janet Yellen spoke on this at the 2016 Jackson Hole Conference. Third, recognizing that low neutral rates may increase the ELB risk, Yellen also cited research by Dave Reifschneider that perhaps 300 basis points could be enough when additional tools such as quantitative easing and threshold forward guidance are used. So having a plan for dealing with ELB risks is a feature of good monetary policy. And fourth, policymakers must always be mindful of unusual inflation risks emanating from supply shocks and challenges. Mindful of these issues, during the 2019-20 Fed Framework Review, the FOMC adopted the 2020 framework. Here's a very quick summary. The framework stated that the federal funds rate is the primary policy instrument. It explicitly mentioned the risk of the effective lower bound and that other policy tools could also be employed. The framework affirmed the 2% PCE inflation objective and added that inflation should average 2% over time. In my opinion, this was the first forceful declaration that the inflation objective was symmetric. The statement indicated that averaging 2% should strengthen the anchoring of inflation expectations. What has become known as flexible average inflation targeting was introduced with reasonably flexible language, also indicating it was state contingent. Specifically, following periods when inflation has been running persistently below 2%, appropriate monetary policy will likely aim to achieve inflation moderately above 2%. The maximum employment mandate was narrowed to focus on employment shortfalls only. I'm laughing. In a literal sense, this seems plausible for a legislative concept of maximum employment. But more operationally, for an economic concept, I think the following is a fair question. Why is low unemployment undesirable? Is it owing to intrinsic labor market dysfunction or Phillips curve inflation risks? This question is at the heart of the focus on shortfalls. In terms of strategic elements, the 2020 framework seemed to cover the range of events that policymakers might face. And the pandemic combined with the Russian invasion of Ukraine presented a strong stress test for the strategy. The monetary shortcomings during this period were more tactical in nature, and I judged the framework to be sturdy. Following the 2012 adoption of the explicit 2% inflation objective, the FOMC had essentially not achieved 2% in the following years. It had certainly not averaged 2%. In the midst of the pandemic, with further low inflation and high unemployment, the September 2024 guidance reinforced the FOMC's commitment to symmetry around 2%. The framework's strategic language was modest in pointing to the possibility that the Fed might intentionally overshoot 2% moderately for some time. In adopting this approach, the Fed's clear expectation was that inflation would arrive through the front door via the flat Phillips curve. But in 2021 and 22, inflation roared through the back door via supply shocks. Faults in complex supply structures, unusual changes in the composition of demand towards goods, and geopolitical shocks. Dealing with these inflation stress events clearly point to improvement opportunities in how the September 2024 guidance could have been better hedged. These seem like tactical weaknesses more than strategic. Although the funds rate increase was delayed to March 2022, the FOMC ultimately met the inflation challenge with an aggressive tightening from March 2022 to July 2023. And this was aligned with the price stability commitments in the framework. Nowhere in the framework does the strategy back away from achieving the 2% inflation objective. All in all, the framework was pretty complete in its ability to handle the wide variety of policy tensions. Yes, more escape hatches for the September 2024 guidance would have been a better tactical implementation of the strategy. But I'm left wondering which states of the world were not covered. Okay, so on the scorecard, Evans calls the long-run framework sturdy. The 2024 guidance implementation could have been improved. The Romer's analysis seems on target in implicating the delays from the maximum employment forward guidance. But assessment should more carefully consider the economic uncertainties during the Delta and Omicron waves in the second half of 2021. These were noteworthy risks to be concerned with at that time, and Powell's 2024 defense at Jackson Hole mentions these. But the scoring must be ruled incomplete without a further consideration of critiques regarding flexible average inflation targeting and shortfalls. Was the 2020 framework an overreach? At some level, I could argue that the new framework displayed humility, but nevertheless, it's fair to wonder if the framework was an overreaction with a large dash of hubris. I will interpret overreaction to mean that strategic features were introduced that handicap the implementation of good monetary policy. Candidates for overreaction are well known here. One, focusing on employment shortfalls, because this sounds the death knell of preemptive monetary policies. And two, introducing two asymmetric features, fate and shortfalls, that lead to asymmetric excess inflation above 2%. So, employment shortfalls, build a better inflation forecast. The Federal Reserve Act instructs the Fed to pursue monetary policies that support maximum employment. This is pretty clear when the unemployment rate is high. When unemployment falls below some notion of the natural or sustainable rate of unemployment, what and how large are the risks that arise? Most public speakers know to avoid stating that high employment is bad or low unemployment is bad. Other euphemisms are employed. As economists, we know that excess demand that drives unsustainable employment levels is likely to lead to undesirable future macroeconomic outcomes. But how large are the risks? In considering low unemployment risks, it seems like 99% of FOMC discussions are about implied inflation risks. The topic of intrinsic dysfunctional labor markets is exceedingly rare. When it comes to inflation implications, in the last quarter century, the uncertainty has been high around the transmission of low unemployment to rising inflation risks. So I look at the long-run framework's focus on shortfalls as an instruction to respond to bona fide inflation risks, but don't do it in a simplistic, lazy fashion that circumvents a vibrant labor market unnecessarily for millions of workers. In a non-accelerationist flat Phillips curve environment with anchored expectations, when does inflation begin to rise? Or more starkly, can any Fed critics pining for preemptive monetary policy write down an explicit inflation model? Many critics want to dismiss Phillips curve inflation forecasts. Okay, but what else do they have in mind? Martingale statistical forecasts are not an economic model. I could go on about that. Put more focus on identifying intrinsic inflation risks when unemployment is low. The output gap is still in play, so go explain that in public. Mervyn King recently suggested a greater emphasis on money and back to basics. Good luck. Yeah. An important critique starts by pointing out that two wrongs are bad. Essentially, introducing two asymmetries implies an excess inflation bias. This is premised on the view that there's an otherwise level playing field and inflation otherwise would be symmetric around the 2% objective without any of these handicaps. I just don't agree with this premise. My view is that central bankers tend to be conservative in the Rogoff 1985 sense. I've always liked Rogoff's insight. Conservative central bankers can offset the Barrow-Gordon discretionary inflation bias. Instead of favoring unsustainable low unemployment outcomes, conservative central bankers may favor higher estimates of the natural rate of unemployment and skew policy towards excess restrictiveness. My casual empiricism, mine, sees very strong conservatism at work in central bank policymakers. For example, why is overshooting pi star controversial in the first place? If central bankers are targeting symmetric 2% inflation, inflation should be above 2% some percentage of the time, perhaps substantial period of time. I'm not saying that everyone who signed on to the 2020 framework saw this implication, but in my view, flexible average inflation targeting and shortfalls do work to offset conservative central banker asymmetries. Now, a first example of why the playing field is not level is straightforward. Conservative central bankers have a strong discomfort with inflation above 2%. State contingent fate encourages averaging away some portion of undershoots, so policymakers are pushed to intentionally shoot for inflation above target on occasion. It's still state contingent and relatively mild. Even if an FOMC decides that recent inflation underruns do not meet the state contingent condition for overshooting, the presence of this statement in the framework further encourages the debate and public commentary. Also, shortfalls encourages greater focus on perceived inflation risk, not simply a bias for below target inflation. My second example is more subtle. When the funds rate's at the effective lower bound for a substantial period, conservative central bankers end up with low confidence in their quantitative easing and forward guidance tools. When the ELB is a material risk and central bankers are forced to keep the funds rate at zero for a long period of time, they're uncomfortable. The SOMA balance sheet may grow too large. The FOMC implemented the maturity extension program in 2011 in part to offset the fear that the SOMA balance sheet would grow too large. A long time spent with threshold forward guidance is not popular either. As the time passes, owing to substantial headwinds at the ELB, if that's the case, the confidence in these policy instruments wanes and excuses emerge for exiting. This lack of confidence is not evident when combating high inflation. Policymakers will tend to have strong confidence that a higher funds rate will solve the inflation problem. If a particular high funds rate isn't reducing high inflation, central bankers can and will keep raising rates. If central bankers have asymmetric instrument confidence, this will reinforce low inflation biases. So fate and shortfalls are modest attempts to offset the low inflation bias that comes from conservative central bankers who are nervous when inflation slowly gets to target or above. So I view them both as useful features that add sturdiness to the strategic framework. Finally, everything starts with 2%. Given the important role that 2% plays, I think the FOMC would be well served by affirmatively stating the case for why 2% is best. Don Cohn said this. I agree with that. In making this case, I presume that the case for 3 or 4% would be strongly argued against. Now, I'm inclined towards a twist on symmetric 2% that would pursue what I refer to as a reverse Trichet strategy. Inflation should be above, but close to 2. A credible implementation would eliminate the need for state contingent fate because you'd be above 2 some part of the time, probably a lot of the time, hopefully a lot of the time. Next, if fate is deleted from the next framework without a credible commitment to symmetry around 2% inflation, I think the long-run framework should be honest and transparent in stating 2% is merely aspirational, essentially a soft ceiling for inflation. This would further reduce the funds rate capacity to respond to strong recessionary pressures, and policymakers should just let the dual mandate and inflation expectation chips fall where they may. This more limited approach seems aligned with recommendations from the BIS in their 2024 annual report, Realistic Policy Ambitions, the Group of 30 study and recommendations, Humbly Do Less, and Raghu Rajan's recent proposals, Less is More. Finally, there are many approaches for adjustments in the Fed's communications approaches. Here I will only mention the role of forward guidance. I think policymakers need to own it and be explicit. In reading policymaker commentaries, I often get the feeling that many would prefer to banish all possibilities of forward guidance. But it's simply not feasible to eschew all forward guidance, and it can be very helpful. For example, the FOMC's most recent 2024 policy communication would likely have been thought of as forward guidance free by many, but it actually doubled down. The Fed's 2024 insistence that they needed confidence before it would be appropriate to reduce the funds rate was forward guidance. Introducing confidence in January 2024 was hugely convenient for knocking down the financial markets' expectations of over 6 rate cuts in 2024, but it became much less convenient as the uncertain endgame arrived. My preference would be for more explicitness in all of these forward guidance policies. They need to own forward guidance from entry to exit. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Charlie. The final presentation will be from Christina Romer and David Romer they have a long question. Did the Federal Reserve's 2020 policy framework limit its response to inflation? Evidence and the implications for the framework review. Christina.
All right, well, thank you. So this graph summarizes the motivation for our paper. It shows the Fed's preferred measure of inflation, PCE inflation in blue, and the federal funds rate in red. And you can see that by March of 2021, inflation had breached the Fed's 2% target. It then rose steadily for a solid year, hitting 7%, before the FOMC made its first move to increase the funds rate in March of 2022. So our contribution to this symposium focuses on the narrow, but we think very important question of what role, if any, did the Fed's 2020 monetary policy framework play in the Fed's slow response to inflation? And to the degree that it did play a role, what does that suggest should be changed in the upcoming framework review? All right, well, we identify 4 elements in the 2020 framework that could have contributed to the slow response. Many of these have already been mentioned, but the adoption of flexible average inflation targeting. The second, which hasn't been mentioned much, is the elevation and strengthening of the maximum employment goal. The third is the asymmetric interpretation of that maximum employment goal. And then the fourth is a move away from preemptive monetary policy. Now, some of these elements are explicit in the short statement on longer run goals, but some are more subtle. And here I think it's really important to understand that the forward guidance, you should think of that as not just tactical implementation, but actually as reflecting how the framework was being interpreted. That's certainly what both Chair Powell and former Vice Chair Clarida said about the forward guidance. And then also we can learn a lot from what policymakers, what Fed leaders said in their speeches and testimony. All right, so as I mentioned, to see how each of these elements actually, what it may have contributed, we're going to use narrative sources. We're going to look at what monetary policymakers said about why they were waiting to raise rates and curtail asset purchases. Now, we won't have the actual transcripts of FOMC meetings for a few more years, so we have to rely on publicly available sources. We're going to use both the minutes and statements from FOMC meetings, the statements and testimony of Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell, and then the speeches of other key Fed members. All right, so what did we find? Well, our first finding is that the move to flexible average inflation targeting really didn't seem to slow the Fed's response to inflation. So remember that FATE aims to counter times of inflation below target by deliberately tolerating some above target inflation for some interval. And as a result, in some instances, this policy strategy could just by design delay how quickly monetary policymakers respond to inflation. But in the case of the post-COVID inflation, the rise in inflation was large enough and fast enough that policymakers pretty quickly knew that inflation was going to average more than 2% over any plausible horizon. So just to give you an example, using the Fed's preferred measure of inflation, by May of 2021, average inflation from the start of the new framework in August 2020 was 3.8% at an annual rate. Even if you go back to before the pandemic, back to February of 2020, the average inflation rate in May, from February 2020 to May 2021, was 2.6%. Now, like most forecasters, monetary policymakers expected much of that inflation to be temporary, but both in their SEP forecasts and in their statements about inflation in the minutes, they show that they expected inflation to return to 2% from above, not to fall below. So, for example, in the June 2021 minutes, we read, looking ahead, participants generally expected inflation to ease, but several participants remarked that they anticipated these supply chain limitations and shortages would put upward pressure on prices into next year. Oh, sorry. All right, so in the narrative record, we just simply don't see policymakers sort of holding back on raising the funds rate because they were concerned that they wouldn't have had enough inflation to achieve their average inflation targeting. Okay, second finding. Rather, what we see as the change in the framework with the most impact was actually the strengthening and elevating of the maximum employment goal. And again, this change was a subtle one. All the 2020 framework said is that the maximum level of employment is a broad-based and inclusive goal. But the speeches of Fed officials and the forward guidance implementing the framework make it clear that the FOMC was interpreting maximum employment in a new way. In essence, they went from aiming for a normal or comfortable level of employment to something much closer to a hot labor market. For example, in his speech at Jackson Hole announcing the new framework, Chair Powell said, with regard to the employment side of our mandate, our revised statement emphasizes that maximum employment is a broad-based and inclusive goal. This change reflects our appreciation of the benefits of a strong labor market, particularly for many in low and moderate income communities. Likewise, in a speech in May of 2022, John Williams first referred to a sizzling hot labor market and also said that with the unemployment rate back to a very low pre-pandemic level and a variety of indicators showing the labor market is very strong, maximum employment has been achieved. And then finally, as Brian talked a lot about, the forward guidance implementing the new framework suggests that the FOMC not only strengthened their maximum employment goal, but also elevated it. And as Brian and I both have done in our slides, what I'm highlighting here is this forward guidance in the September 2020 statement, and it's that repeated use of the word and. You have to hit the employment, the inflation target, and the maximum employment goal. And I think reflecting the FOMC's view that the Phillips curve was now very flat, their new, very optimistic view of maximum employment was described as a goal that could be met in addition to or separate from the inflation goal. All right, well, we think that this strengthening and elevation of the maximum employment goal mattered. Right? So at Jackson Hole in 2021, when the inflation rate was running at 4%, Chair Powell explained why the Fed wasn't tightening. Right? Said if a central bank tightens policy in response to temporary factors, the effects are likely to arrive after the need is passed. And today, with substantial slack remaining in the labor market, such a mistake could be particularly harmful. That is, they were not tightening despite inflation, in part because they hadn't reached their new optimistic maximum employment goal. Another indication that the revised maximum employment goal mattered, I think, came at the September 2021 FOMC meeting. So at this meeting, participants had marked up their inflation forecasts. They said inflation was likely to be more long-lasting, unemployment was down to 5.2%, and yet various participants stressed that economic conditions were likely to justify keeping the rate at or near its lower bound over the next couple of years, right? It sure feels like they must be waiting for a much stronger labor market if they thought it was going to take that long. And then at the December 2021 meeting, participants explicitly said, we have more than met our inflation goal, but they still held off on raising rates because the labor market was not yet strong enough. And just to anchor things here, the unemployment rate at that point was down to 4.2%. So our read of the narrative record is that monetary policymakers felt that they had committed to a hot labor market in both the framework and the forward guidance, and did not raise rates despite inflation because the labor market was not yet hot enough. Now, the third finding is that the asymmetric treatment of the maximum employment goal could matter, but probably wasn't relevant in the recent episode. As have been discussed by other participants at the symposium, right, the obvious change that was contained in the 2020 framework was this notion that the Fed would only respond to shortfalls of employment from its maximum level, not deviations from maximum. That is, that employment would be allowed to run above its maximum level, absent other causes for concern. However, we don't actually see any evidence that this change mattered in the slow response to inflation in 2021 and 2022. And the reason is that both because of the labor market disruptions caused by the pandemic and because of the Fed's very optimistic view of maximum employment, monetary policymakers never believed that employment was above its maximum level. As the quote from John Williams that I showed you before emphasized, it wasn't until March of 2022 that the FOMC thought they were at maximum employment. And we find no instances in the documents of participants arguing that employment was or was likely to become noticeably above their optimistic view of its maximum level. So as a result, monetary policymakers were never in the position of standing by while they believed that employment was above its maximum. Now, we do provide some evidence in the paper that the asymmetric interpretation of the maximum employment goal and or deliberately seeking a hot labor market is in general dangerous. And in particular, if we look at times over history, when the unemployment rate projected by the Fed staff was below their estimate of the natural rate for at least a year, we find that the outcomes were almost never good. So such episodes of unemployment persistently below the natural rate almost always ended in inflation, or in the case of the late 1990s, an asset price boom. Now, the one exception was the very robust labor market of the late 2010s, which actually features very prominently in Chair Powell's discussions of the low costs of a strong labor market. But we'd suggest that history suggests that this is much more likely to have been the exception rather than the rule. All right, finally, our fourth finding, we think that the move away from preemptive policy likely did slow the monetary response to the post-COVID inflation. So, of course, the 2020 Statement on Longer Run Goals still talked about the need for policy to be based on forecasts. But in their forward guidance and policy discussions, monetary policymakers put much more emphasis on actual outcomes. Recall the forward guidance said that employment had to actually be at its maximum level, and inflation had to actually be at 2% before the FOMC started raising rates. And members made clear that this was deliberate, right? So the minutes from the April 2021 meeting said, participants noted that the existing outcome-based guidance implied that the path of the funds rate would depend on actual progress toward reaching the committee's maximum employment and inflation goals, not on uncertain economic forecasts. As we discuss in the paper, if one looks at the Survey of Economic Projections, say in September of 2021, which is what I have here, right, the forecasts are for inflation to be well over 2% and unemployment to be very low over the horizon before which monetary policy could affect the economy. Thus, if policy were being based on forecasts, FOMC participants would likely have voted to raise rates substantially earlier, even given their optimistic interpretation of maximum employment. This strongly suggests that the move away from preemption was an additional factor slowing down the response to inflation. All right, so our key finding is that two features of the 2020 framework revision contributed strongly to the Fed's slow response. Those were the elevation and strengthening of the maximum employment goal and the move away from preemption. This leads naturally to two suggestions for the next framework review. The first is to back off from the changes to the employment goal. Monetary policy ultimately cannot reduce poverty, inequality, or the natural rate of unemployment. Therefore, monetary policy can't do better than aim to keep employment at the level consistent with the natural rate of unemployment. Now, obviously, policymakers should invest serious resources in identifying the natural rate and should not hesitate to revise it in light of evidence, but aiming for a hot labor market is not a sensible strategy. And though we don't find that the focus on shortfalls for maximum employment was a source of the slow policy response in this instance, we do provide evidence that it's not been a recipe for success in the past. So while they are restoring the previous interpretation of the maximum employment goal, we would go back to the focus on deviations both above and below full employment, not just shortfalls. The second suggestion, motivated by our findings, is that monetary policy should be forward-looking. Because monetary policy affects the economy with a lag, policymakers simply have no choice but to make policy on the basis of forecasts. The right response to repeated errors is not to forecast errors, is not to abandon preemptive policy, but to improve the forecasts and to revise the forecasts in response to mistakes. And then finally, in response to in addition to the two changes closely related to our findings, we have two other suggestions for the framework review. One is we actually think that flexible average inflation targeting seems like a good addition and should remain. It's unlikely to cause problems and could help to anchor inflation expectations. And the one suggestion we have sort of echoes something I think Brian said, that is they should make it clear that it only applies when conventional monetary policy is constrained by the zero lower bound. And then finally, the second idea that we'd like to put on the table is that explicit forward guidance should be used sparingly. Because one of the things we find in our analysis is that the policy response to inflation was slow in part because of the explicit forward guidance. That was another factor making policy less nimble. So our preference, perhaps like English and Sack, is that the next statement of the framework emphasize that all tools will be used to reach the Fed's goals, but that policymakers will save explicit forward guidance for special cases when they want to promise to behave unusually, so that they don't get locked into a policy path. And then more generally, again echoing English and Sack, the 2020 revision to the policy strategy, it was a good faith attempt to improve monetary policy making, but it was overly tailored to the specific conditions of the late 2010s. As policymakers consider revisions, we'd aim for more universality and robustness to a range of possible developments, and they should seek ways to enhance their ability to respond quickly to changing economic conditions. Thank you.
Thank you, Christy. We're going to open up for questions and comments. I will ask people to please be as brief as possible. The first card went up before Brian was 5 minutes in, so we'll have a lot of interest. First mover was David Wilcox.
Thank you for organizing this incredibly important and timely session. I want to mainly align myself, but not entirely, with Team Evans. The session summary, I think, is a good place to start. It was otherwise excellent, but it had one important misstatement. It said that in September 2020, the forward guidance implementing the new framework, the Fed went further. It said it would keep its target for the federal funds rate until zero, until both the employment and price stability objectives had actually been met. In fact, the statement did not say that. It said the committee expects it will be appropriate. And the difference is absolutely critical. That language, it seems to me, is not the language of commitment from a central bank. Moreover, later in the statement, the committee wrote as follows: they would be prepared to adjust the stance of monetary policy as appropriate if risks emerge that could impede the attainment of the committee's goals. Bill and Brian briefly mentioned these qualifications, but it seems to me set them aside as being of no consequence. The question that's never been answered is, why didn't the committee exercise their escape options that they had so clearly built into the statement? Did they not feel constrained by that language because they really believed the transitory forecast? Or did they somehow see themselves, despite having engineered those escape clauses, as nonetheless having made a firm commitment? The committee, I think, owes us all an explanation of their thinking on this point, and the upcoming framework review would be an ideal place to provide it. I'll briefly just mention, I think a move away from shortfalls back to deviations would be a mistake. I find it really hard to defend a policy framework that envisions tightening the stance of monetary policy merely because too many people have jobs. And that's essentially what reverting to deviations would convey. And I also think it would be a mistake to go back to traditional inflation targeting. My thinking here is very similar to the Romer and Romer logic, so I won't bother spelling that out. Just to show that I can disagree with somebody other than Bill and Brian, I'll pick for a second on Charlie. He recommends having a conversation now about the 2% objective. I think that will eventually be important, but it seems to me that the risk right now is too great of demonstrating to the outside world that the Fed isn't serious about attaining its inflation objective, and that the next time inflation gets out of hand, they'll abandon ship. I think the right time probably will be the 2030 review after 5 good years of inflation performance have been logged, rather than taking it up now. There were important problems during this episode, but neither of these were highlighted by the papers. The labor market behaved for a time as if it was much tighter operationally than had been indicated by the conventional metric, namely the gap, the unemployment gap. The Fed and many of us on the outside, myself very much included, were slow to recognize that. By the way, Dave Reichschneider has a very important observation that these indicators are all coming into line. Overall, I suggest being really cautious about drawing conclusions from an extraordinary period a once-in-a-century pandemic about the conduct of monetary policy in more ordinary times.
Thank you. Jason Furman, briefly.
Yes. So I'm going to make one of the 8 points I had been planning to make.
Thank you.
The one thing I think that was missing from all of this that's really worth thinking about, and I don't know the answer to it, is the degree to which gradualism has increasingly become part of the way monetary policy is conducted. That's combined with various forms of forward guidance, and it basically said before, don't start raising rates until you're really, really, really sure that you should raise rates, which guarantees that you'll basically raise them too late. And you could argue you're seeing it now until you're completely, inflation came down 2 percentage points over the last year, but rates weren't constantly adjusting, even though a Taylor rule would say they should constantly be adjusting. It's like they waited until they were 1.5 points off and then started making the adjustment. That has an advantage of keeping things more gradual. You don't have big disruptive rate increases, for example, a couple of years ago with financial stability. It means your words matter a lot more, for better or for worse, and markets often complain about it. But it also guarantees you're behind the curve and means the only interest rates you're using are basically long rates, and you're not taking advantage of the fact that short rates can also matter too. So should the Fed be less gradual, less afraid to reverse itself and make a move and then undo some of that move, or even go to the extreme of being a random walk where it incorporates all the information, and in every meeting rates are as likely to go up or down based on what they learned in the previous 6 weeks?
Ben Bernanke.
So good presentations. I agree with a lot, including Brian's puzzlement over the QE policy. But the thing that I'm missing from the whole discussion, and I understand it's hard to do, is the counterfactual. Suppose we had the 2018 framework. The inflation we saw was arguably, and at least the Fed thought, and I believe it's true, largely driven by supply shocks. And if they thought it was transitory, then even under the old framework, they would have taken time to make sure that, not to move until they at least until they saw some movement in inflation expectations. I think Ralph Schneider's paper says it wouldn't have made much difference if they had gone a few months earlier. So anyway, that's my point. What's the counterfactual? Would it have made that much difference quantitatively if they had been on the old framework?
Okay, Rick Mishkin.
So 4 points. The first is on
They're going to be short points, right? Okay.
So 4 points. The first is that I think that the flexible average inflation target is actually a very good idea, but the details really matter. And I think the big mistake was the communication, where there was no definition of what the horizon is. And if there's no definition of the horizon, and it goes infinite, you've actually dropped your inflation target. And that was the danger. I don't think it actually mattered, and I agree with Christy on this. And the reason I think it didn't matter is because what I think has become the Powell doctrine, which is when you make a mistake, you fix it quickly and turn around your operation quickly. I'm calling it a doctrine now because they did it again, just in this last meeting. The second is something that Ben and I focused on when we did our work on inflation targeting, which is the dangers of having a maximum employment target. We just don't know what that is. And you can get into a lot of trouble as a result of that. The third point is that I think a key part of the mistake, and also led to the absence of preemption, was the view in the Federal Reserve that the Phillips curve is flat. And in fact, we did some research on this for the U.S. Monetary Policy Forum, which talked about what happens in an economy which is actually heating up, which is that the Phillips curve is actually not a structural relationship as estimated. And the reason it's not is because monetary policy can be endogenous, and good monetary policy will actually mean that there'll be zero correlation between the policy instrument and actually the outcome in terms of inflation. And that's a standard theorem from optimal control. And in fact, this is also work that Ted Royo also focused on. And if you think there's a flat Phillips curve, then you can worry less about preemption. And in fact, our research said the Phillips curve is not flat. If you look at cases where you can avoid the issue of endogenous monetary policy, you see a Phillips curve that stayed the same. So I think that was a serious part of the problem. The last point is on the issue of risks from supply shocks. And I think, Ben, you're absolutely right that if it's a pure supply shock, then you're supposed to wait and let it come down. But I think the big mistake of so-called team transitory was that they ignored the demand shocks. In particular, there were two huge demand shocks. One was huge fiscal expansion, and the second was the fact that everybody couldn't spend any money and actually increase their savings. And then when they were allowed, starting with the vaccine, allowed to get out and party, they started spending a lot. And I think that was also a very serious part of the mistake that was made. So
Thank you.
hopefully I've been brief.
You have been. Dan Chirulo.
Thanks, Jen. So I wonder whether we're getting into a situation now where every 5 years there's a redo of the monetary policy framework in order to correct the mistakes from the one that was concluded 5 years ago. And this is a much broader question than the ones that any of the panelists addressed, but I wonder whether it's worth asking what we think the utility of the monetary policy framework is. That is, if it's something that's pretty brief, it seems as though it's either not going to really be too determinative of policy at any one meeting or the course of a few quarters. But if it gets very specific, then it runs the risk of becoming outdated pretty quickly. The alternative would be a much longer document, which would address a number of contingent situations. We're near the effective lower bound, or no, we're running a hot labor market. So I guess that's the question I've got. What do we think it's really doing? Because although Christy and David, I think, made a really interesting effort using circumstantial evidence to show the impact of the framework, I kind of wonder whether it's actually the people who did the framework already had that view. They put it in the framework, but that's what they were going to do anyway in monetary policy. It wasn't that they were looking at the framework and saying, oh, this is what we need to do.
Joe Bulio, and then Don Cohn.
I'd suggest that fate and the recommendations for policy that were expressed in this conference are kind of having the background a somewhat fuzzy, if not unspecified model for inflation expectations. Now, to be sure, there are periods of time when I think I have a good handle of what inflation expectations, the model behind it. In the 70s, it was like, what was it last period? In the Great Moderation, 2%-ish. But the rub is like the transition period in between those two. So how did we get from one to the other back then? Well, Volcker. And then I was just kind of like, let's not look too carefully at kind of like the length of time between that transition period. And that became very important. So when I was tasked with pumping out what was pretty bad inflation forecasts, I was constantly asking myself, how should I think about the process for inflation expectations? Because my model for inflation said it's inflation expectations plus stuff. And sure, in the long run, I was happy with writing down 2%, a period of time when I was hoping to be retired. In the long run, which is a period of time which I was hoping to be retired and not dead. But trying to think of like where we were going from where we were to then was in fact the entire problem, and I really didn't have any kind of model that I could really rely on.
Don?
So 3 very interesting papers, and the dialogue between Charlie and the other 2, along with the dialogue around the table, has reinforced in my mind the necessity for the Fed to start with a review of what happened. We need to know how it views the forecast issues, the framework issues, the forward guidance and QE issues, and maybe even the process, how they arrived at all this stuff. So I think a lot of other central banks are starting with a review, sometimes internal, sometimes they hire Ben Bernanke to do it for them, external. But I think the Fed needs to start there. And it's just reinforce that. A second point is, I think this is the Romers convinced me that it wasn't the framework, it was the forward guidance that was mainly at fault. But I do think the forward guidance was derived from the framework, as the Fed said, and it was derived because they expected to get to 2% from below, and therefore holding accommodative policy until you get to full employment just facilitated the FAIT, the averaging above. And two things happen, as people have pointed out. Inflation was really high for a while. And then the second thing was the misjudgment or the difficulty of judging where full employment was, as Rick was saying. So those two changes happened, and then they didn't trigger as far as we know, they didn't discuss the escape clauses. And why didn't they discuss? So that's part of what I meant by process. How did this happen this way? And then finally, I think, Charlie, you've got 4 points there. You need number 5, which is preemptive policy. And anything that's best practice monetary policy. You're going to make mistakes. Your forecasts are going to be wrong, but you've got to use the forecast. And the labor market is a really key element in the forecast of future inflation. And I don't see, and your paper seems to say you don't need that. You got to use other things to do that. So I don't get that. So I think it's you got to make sure the framework doesn't get in the way of preemption. Thank you.
Okay, I'm in the familiar position of having more speakers than minutes left, so please continue to be brief. Ben Harris and then Valerie Ramey.
So more of a question than a comment, but on Don's point about the Fed reviewing its actions over the past several years, I can't help but wonder if there's one issue which dominates all the issues that were brought up here today, and that's that the inclusion of shelter in the Fed's preferred measure of inflation. There are a lot of reasons to think that shelter should not be included. Here are a few. One, the measure is based on a long lag that we don't really understand. 1 year ago in August 2023, the San Francisco Fed projected shelter inflation. They thought today, year over year, it would be plus 5%. Sorry, minus 2%. Today it's actually plus 5%. It's a massive miss. We just don't understand the length of this lag and some of the dynamics there. The second is more theoretical. If a price rises and consumers don't pay it, should the Fed fight it? I'm not sure. I mean, I'm talking about owner-occupied rent here, not the rental side of things. My house went up quite a bit over the past several years. I paid nothing for that. Third is around the weighting. The weight is based, at least in the CPI, around a survey of consumers ask for owner-occupied homes, what would your home rent for? I have no idea. My guess is that the 40,000 people who are asked a similar question also don't have any idea. So should that question be used to size the weight in the CPI? And lastly, we really don't understand the transmission between monetary policy and housing. Paul Krugman has raised this many times, particularly in the wake of persistently low mortgage rates that feature quite a bit of refinancing. So given all of these misunderstandings or failures to understand precisely aspects of shelter in PCE, should the Fed really be including this in its measure of inflation, particularly when it's such a massive part of the basket?
Great session. I wanted to make 2 points. First of all, I think we should take optimal control more seriously. And I was so happy when Rick mentioned this, all right? What's the dual mandate? Price stability. Now, we think of that more as prices going up at 2% per year. So in the objective function, I think we should have the price path at whatever the inflation target is. And the second is full employment, all right? Solve that problem. You can put on adjustment costs, all those sorts of things, but it says that what you should be targeting is the price path. And economists knew before that temporary inflation does not mean a temporary increase in the price level. The rest of the population just figured that out. And so that is why there's so much unhappiness, and that's why optimal control theory says you should target the price path. Second thing is, thank you to David and Christy. Once again, we should call them Detective Romer and Romer. They've delved in. I had asserted, but without good evidence like theirs, is that I thought that a big source, this was at Jackson Hole a few years ago, that a big source of allowing inflation to get out of hand was this change in which unemployment rate went into the objective functions. And it appears from the Fed's actions that they've adopted Rawlsian justice, or maybe they aren't doing it anymore, where they decided to minimize the unemployment rate of the most marginal worker. And the cost of that has been the rest of the population had much higher inflation. And there are a lot of people with nominal wage contracts. So we're seeing this effect in real wages and particularly inequality across, depending on what kind of contract you have.
Martin Bailey and Randy Krausner.
I think we should build more uncertainty. This has come up, other comments have made this, build more uncertainty into the what we think the Fed should do. I think we sort of imbue the Fed with supernatural powers, which it doesn't have. And I don't think we know how to forecast this economy terribly well. I don't think we necessarily know, I mean, we know the direction of monetary policy and what's it going to do, but I don't know that we know the effects that well, how it's going to play out over time. There are lots of other things that affect inflation, fiscal policy, commodity prices, as people have said, productivity. So there are lots of things going on that we don't necessarily know. So I don't think we can do optimal control because I don't think we understand the system well enough to apply that in this situation. Now, I've always sort of supported the 2% target, but I got to admit I'm sort of shaking on it because it suggests we know more than we do know, and that, a target sort of implies that the Fed knows how to get there and it does the certain things, then it'll get there in a given amount of time. I think it's fine if we sort of view the target as that's what we'd like it to be, but we need to recognize and build in all the things that we say and do and that we tell the population out there is that we actually don't have the means necessarily to hit a target at some particular time. It's okay.
It's on.
It's on? Yes? Great, thank you very much. Excellent papers. Given the time constraint, I'll just make one point, really building on what Bill and Brian mentioned in their paper and thinking about the role of QE. Something that I think would be extremely valuable in developing the framework is thinking about a clear distinction between monetary policy and financial stability and market functioning. And so I think we saw very much what happened in March, April of 2020 is being a failure of drawing that distinction. Once the Fed started to buy a lot of assets to try to restore market functioning, which I think was totally reasonable, it was extraordinarily difficult for them to get out from that without implicitly signaling some sort of tightening. Because they didn't say, well, we are doing this explicitly for financial stability purposes, and that is distinct from monetary policy purposes. A really nice example where this worked quite well was the Bank of England with the liquidity-driven investment issues that they had in 22. So the Bank of England went in, started buying assets right at the time that they said, well, we're trying to fight inflation, we're trying to reduce our balance sheet, but they said we have a market dysfunction problem, so we're going to do this. We're doing this in a targeted, temporary way. Andrew Bailey made a very bold announcement, said, and on Friday we're going to stop. The markets were shocked at this, and I don't think the Fed would have been bold enough to do that, rather than take the risk that maybe they would have a little bit of instability. But he did that. The markets reacted, I think, appropriately, and they were able to deal with the issue. And I think a lot of, and some of the problems that the Fed got into was being stuck in buying all of those assets at a dramatically faster pace than in the global financial crisis. And I think it's a very important part of the monetary policy framework not to say, well, we don't have to talk about financial stability. Whenever you're going to be doing anything extraordinary in monetary policy, it's always going to be somehow related to financial stability.
Okay, and Carolyn Hawksby. And we'll go back to each author team for feedback.
So I'm going to put on my labor economics hat for a moment and quote the Romers, quoting Jeremy Powell, with my emphasis. Maximum employment is a broad-based and inclusive goal. This change reflects our appreciation for the benefits of a strong labor market, particularly in many low and moderate income communities. I think that this is, as a labor economist, I think that this is shockingly naive, just shockingly naive. The notion that the only thing that makes low-income or disadvantaged people in the United States different from high-income people or moderate-income people is just that they have lower wages on average is a little crazy. And I think that the FOMC does not contain enough labor economics knowledge to be able to target maximum employment where they're digging deeper and deeper into a community that is poorly understood without that labor economics knowledge, to make that a goal. There's nothing wrong with that being a goal, but you need to bring in the expertise about that community. The last time really low-income and disadvantaged communities were at close to full employment was during the Clinton administration, and I think there were a lot of other policies involved as well. It was not a monetary policy type of thing.
Okay. And back to the authors, we'll just keep the same order and start with Bill and Brian.
Okay, let me, too many things to talk about, but I'll respond to a few of the comments. On David Wilcox, as he said, we have a couple paragraphs on the fact that the committee chose to stick with its guidance. It didn't obviously need to. And we'll all be interested to see in the transcripts what the discussion was around that. We said in the document that we thought they probably were hesitant to abandon the guidance because they'd be concerned that it would weaken guidance as a tool in the future. I guess I still think that's probably right. They also figured they could adjust policy faster later to make up for it. That's actually what they did, and so I think that was not an unreasonable thing to think about. David also liked shortfalls. He said we shouldn't tighten policy because too many people have jobs. I guess I think sometimes central banks should tighten policy because too many people have jobs. I mean, if the labor market's really tight, and you think with good reason that that's going to push up wage and price inflation, it's appropriate to respond to that. I just think you have to be preemptive, and that will require making decisions like that, and nobody said monetary policy was easy. Ben Bernanke said, gee, what's the counterfactual? I think that is interesting to think about. I don't have an answer. I guess I think with the old framework and the old guidance, the Evans rule guidance, they would have been raising rates sooner because they would have not had to make some decision to abandon their forward guidance. It would have just fallen out that with inflation high, they would have exited sooner. And I think that would have been better. Don Cohn said the Fed needs to start with the review of what happened. I think that's fair. That's kind of what we got from Powell at Jackson Hole. And then he said Charlie needs to think about preemptive policy. I just agree. I think monetary policy has to be forward-looking, and they got themselves in a situation where that was very hard to do, as the Romer's work showed. Do you have anything further?
No. Okay. Charlie?
First, before I forget, I disagree with the Romer's characterization of the 96 to 2000 period. I mean, I think the 90s was about the best decade that we've probably had. Unemployment came down throughout the entire decade. Inflation came down. It was at 2% towards the end of the period. There was a budget surplus. And productivity growth started accelerating for a 10-year period. So maybe there's a financial instability issue with the dot-com bust, but among all the things that we've experienced, that was about the least painful. So I'm not sure when there's been a bad macroeconomic, period because of pushing strong, economy since inflation expectations were anchored after 1990, I would say. Preemptive monetary policy, sure, yeah, I agree with that too. I just don't think that, if you're going to do it because unemployment is now where? At your natural rate of unemployment, is it 5? Is it 5.5%, 4.5%, 3.5%? I had extensive arguments with various participants, and, it's like, I'm not going to get worried until we get lower, until I see inflation. I think there ought to be an inflation forecast. You've got the output gap. You can look at the output gap and be preempted. You won't like it because you have to have trend output, and that moves around about as much as all of this. But I think that, something other than just we're at 6. During the 2010 period with the beverage curve, when it moved out, there was a discussion, has the natural rate gone up by 3 percentage points? And then that infects the entire discussion on the way down. Well, I think we're going to get inflation beforehand. Get an inflation forecast that's useful from independent means, other means. Why didn't inflation go down? This is part of the aftermath. Look at it. Why didn't inflation come down? Did the Fed really reduce inflation. They took the funds rate to 5.3%, but the unemployment rate's at 4.2. It's not the traditional method for doing this. In some sense, it's the unwinding of all the supply factors. I agree with Ben and your work with Blanchard, and I think that had an important part, and there's been some unwinding. Understanding that is very important for all of this, but it's not obvious. I worry about taking on new mandates. Throughout all of this, you should look through supply shocks, and traditionally it's been hard. Ben, you had a long ago Brookings paper looking at the oil shock where you should look through and things like that. This is an old issue, but this has been worse. You know, it's like 15% of the CPI basket goes up by 20%. 15%. And it's like used car prices. They go up by 10% in a month in all of this. You're taking on new mandates when you're looking at all these relative price increases that are going in there. And I think part of the answer that the FOMC struggled with is it kept looking like it was getting better, and then it wasn't. So you have to pay attention. Housing prices are high. We need more supply. This is an important, issue. There's so many micro issues that need to be attendant with understanding this, and then how much of it gets into inflation expectations. Inflation expectations, they've been remarkably anchored throughout this, and I think that's just critical for all of this.
Thanks, Charlie. David and Christy.
Thank you. First of all, these are great comments. We really appreciated them, and I'm not going to obviously respond to the vast majority of them. On the late 90s, yes, there were lots of good features. Our point was there was also a bad macroeconomic effect of an extremely hot labor market. I also want to cite the first round of the start of the Great Inflation as a period where running a hot labor market with well-anchored inflation expectations led to high inflation. So we've now had two of those. But I think the escape clause question that David Wilcox raised, the very first comment, I think that's super important. Our reading is, I think it's close to Bill and Brian, but it's a little bit, they wanted a hot labor market. They really, really wanted a hot labor market, and they were not willing to back off that just because inflation was high and above their target. And I think beyond that, then they had really committed themselves, and to say that they had a clearly built-in escape clause, it was clearly built in. It was quite pro forma. So I think this ties into Don Cohn's point that the Fed really needs to look back and look at what happened. On the important question that Ben raised to the counterfactual, I think also Rick's point that there was high demand as well as strong supply. By say September 2021. They were clearly on track to reach any reasonable estimate of maximum employment. They were clearly, inflation wasn't going to fall below 2, so they would have tightened earlier. How big a difference that would have made? Presumably not a lot. That's a matter of 6 months. But I think if they had a time machine and could tighten earlier and hadn't been so strongly invested in what they'd done, I think they would do that. A comment people haven't picked up on, I think is very important, is Jason's broader comment about gradualism. That is one of the reasons. I mean, the Fed seems very, very slow moving. So before we raise rates, we have to wind out forward guidance. Before we wind asset purchases, before we wind out asset purchases, we have to tell people that we're doing that. Before we do that, we have to tell people that we're going to tell them that we're going to do that. And that is one of the reasons why we think that putting explicit forward guidance in the statements is dangerous. Sure, in an ideal world, you'd be very nimble, but the Fed is by nature not a nimble institution. If you want to give people speculation in your speeches about what you think the path of the funds rate might plausibly be, if you want to put in some dot plots, that's fine. But if you're prone to be very slow moving, why compound that? Two final comments. We agree strongly with every single word that Don Cohn said, so just everyone go and reread their notes on that. On the issue of raising rates because so many people have jobs, I think there's a really important distinction that Brian drew between what's the objective and what's the input into policy. Yes, the ideal labor market, if we could wave a magic wand and have any labor market we wanted, would be extremely hot. So if you're evaluating, say, the outcomes of policy, you shouldn't penalize it because the labor market was stronger than the natural rate. But we can't wave that magic wand, so as an input into policy, you might reasonably, in many cases, say, because the labor market is hot or because we expect it to be hot, that is one consideration for why we're raising rates. And I think it's a little bit of a cheat to say, well, we're not going to do that, we'll just look at the output gap. That's really just a roundabout way of doing the same things. You've got to, as Bill said, monetary policy is hard, and part of the hard part is the communication. You have to go up to Congress and let Wright Patman or some current senator yell at you that you don't like people having jobs, and you have to explain to them that no, you care just as much as they do about that, and your policies are designed with the same goals that they have, but you think that that doesn't mean you can just have a very hot labor market all the time.
Great. Thank to all three of our author teams for terrific papers and a great session.